The Adriatic. The next morning we woke to find ourselves at Fiume. There was a high mountain behind the town, and up this we walked, looking down upon the river which divides Fiume from Yugoslavia. Before we reached the more open tracts of the hillside, it was necessary to skirt round certain cultivated plots. Across the river we could see a slaughterhouse with cattle in its yard. I've never been able to look at an abattoir without a neurotic recoil, yet none can eat with more relish the tender section of a sirloin. Men late at night moving about in slaughterhouse yards with lanterns in their hands is a conception that haunts the mind of my brother John. Even in the English countryside there is something horrible about these small whitewashed houses at the ends of blind lanes. The beasts that we eat resemble us too closely. When in cowslip meadows we stand to regard their large black liquid eyes before they turn aside their heavy bovine heads, it is hard to feel that we can ever win pardon. We bespeak ox-cheek for our soup with thoughtless assurance, unappreciative of the shocking ferocity of such a domestic order. At last the path we followed opened out upon the slope of the mountain. A number of pine trees were growing between large protruding rocks, and through them we made our way. We came to a track presently that led down the other side of the mountain. I proposed returning by the bank of the river. At intervals, as we followed the zigzag way, we could see through the trees a succession of bare, shell-rock-covered mountains. They reminded me of Wyoming scenery. At the foot of the hill we came to a grassy glade, level and shadowed by far smaller trees. 1,000 little cyclamen flowers, purple and with petals of the uncommon shape peculiar to its species, they grew here in the grass. We gathered a handful of them. We found that the river flowed too close under the mountain for any track to be on this side of it. However, we saw a bridge and advanced under the trees toward it. It was barricaded on the near side by a network of barbed wire. On the other side, over the wire, stood a Yugoslavian sentry with a fixed bayonet. We reasoned with this soldier, but it soon became clear that no kind of blandishment would persuade him to let us through. There was nothing for it but to retrace our steps. Back we went up the narrow path, back under the pine trees and young oaks, until we could see once more from the mountain-top the wide blue expanse of the Adriatic. When we reached the road above the town, we met many women carrying baskets of produce into market. They had straps fastened round their shoulders. A brave, upright type, they seemed, healthy, mountain-bred, of the very kind to bring into the world offspring to pester Mussolini. From Fiume we sailed to Ancona. I had always honoured this place for being the native town of the most enlightened of the Crusaders, for it was here that Frederick II, red, bald and short-sighted, was born. Ancona was given its name by early Greek colonists because of the elbow-like crook of the bluff protecting its harbour, and this peculiarity of the seaport I observed. The city had a fine atmosphere of antiquity about it. There were high, narrow stairways leading up from the dungeon dark recesses of its ancient walls. We climbed to the cathedral and looked up at the columns which once belonged to the very temple of Venus, celebrated by Catullus. There was a wedding taking place at one of the altars, an incredible ceremony of tinsel modernity, such as one sees reflections of in photographic groups in the Italian quarter of New York City. I did not envy those two young people so obviously entrapped by the society in which they lived, and, likely enough, for what I could see, to be mightily incommoded by their own self-deluded, self-interested, uncivilized spirits. I was glad enough to be quit of their contriving lives, and with a free heart to observe the fruit sellers at the street corners. For how lovely the figs, grapes, pomegranates looked, and the tamarisks beyond the town walls of the particular glaucous colour, which we had noticed belonged to the warders of the Rhone. We came upon a small but very ancient church. It was being repaired, and we stepped into it for a moment to look about. The caretaker told us that the church had been built in the 5th century, and that in their excavations they had found the bodies of men of that time. I asked what they looked like, and he said that the men's faces were of a black complexion, and that they had golden hair but no beards. When we got back to the boat, we found that they were taking on 50 horses, presents from the King of Italy to the new King of Albania. The animals were led one by one into a crate, which was then swung up over our heads and down into the hold. We stood for a time watching the procedure. Some of the animals would plunge and hang back, and only with the greatest difficulty be persuaded to enter the box. Once inside, they could give no further trouble. But we observed that when they were let out, they would be trembling with apprehension. Many of them would slip without reason on the smooth wood, as they stepped nervously from their imprisonment. When this happened, an Italian passenger who was standing by us would give us a Confederate smile, as though in some way the mischance had rewarded all 3 of us. The horses were unloaded again at Durazzo. Here we went ashore. I was pleased enough to find myself in Albania, and immediately upon landing we separated ourselves from the ship's company and set out walking along the cliffs. It seemed a wild land, but tempting to explore. We looked down upon a coast with the waves curling about low ridges of rock, bordered higher up by seaweed, and everywhere the sky was blue except on the furthest horizon where it was purple. The bright sunshine, the trees made me delight in my liberty. I was as fascinated by the familiar as by the unfamiliar. To see at my feet the ragged succory flower so common in England, so common on Staten Island, to watch peculiar butterflies settle upon a plant of common fleabane, gave an edge to the strangeness of the land. Through the thistles and prickly scrub we pushed our way. Bushes of broom were in flower. All was new, all was exciting. Yet together with the sense of freedom came hints that we were approaching the confines of an ancient barbarism. We saw starved ponies, bleeding and mutilated between the shafts of overweighted carts made of hurdles. We saw veiled women. We saw dark brown men with daggers at their sides and clubs in their hands, ready enough to knock the eye out of the head of animal or man. How the Nordic races, the men from the forests of the north, ever managed to hold their own against such cutthroats is more than I know. It was plain that the gentry of the country would think no more of spilling blood than of spitting. There were no docks at Durazzo. To the north of the landing place was a flat field of rotting seaweed with a flock of geese scavenging upon it. I saw a water wagtail here also. At night I stood by the taffrail upon the upper deck. A perfect circle surrounded the ship, which itself was the centre of the circumference. To the northward the sky was dark. Under the moon the surface of the sea shivered with shifting shields of silver. The Adriatic was calm, and I knew that every hour was bringing me nearer and nearer to Palestine, to the Lake of Galilee, to the Holy Sepulchre.